awkward moment, like also when I'm teaching, is what do you do when people aren't quite here, but some of them are here, but not everybody's here? Like you just kind of stare awkwardly or like do something. I was watching some of the old episodes, like I say the exact same thing like every single time. And that's why I'm kind of monologuing now, because I'm trying really hard not to say the thing that I say every time, and I'm not going to say it. So
there are so many like TikToks and like videos of like what happens when like a teacher or a person is like, so let me share my screen and like the pause and like the staring away from the camera. And I've realized that I've been doing that, but now what I do, because at Berkeley, even though we're on Zoom and everyone's online, everyone's at their homes or wherever they are, we still start 10 minutes after. For some reason, we have Berkeley time. And so during these 10 minutes when I have my class, while I'm waiting for everyone to show up, I'm just like blasting like music from my phone, because I'm like, I don't want to deal with your extra questions. You can have your extra questions at the end of class. I've set aside time at the end of class. So we're just going to chill and listen to my music for like 15 minutes.
I think the kids love that, actually.
Oh, they do. Yeah.
Then they don't have to think of clever questions. Right?
That's exactly. Right. It kind of takes the edge off of that. Maybe I should do this. The thing that terrifies me is like, because I'm an old, like any music I play, like I would be judged on. Like, and I can't handle my students judging my pop culture tastes. So like, I couldn't emotionally deal with that right now. So I don't want to do that. So. Maybe I would just be trying too hard, and maybe I'll just play like Mahler or something like that and just kind of give up, like who knows. Anyway, all right, I think we should get going. So thank you again, Rachel. I want to recognize her. Welcome everybody to Drinking with Historians. Thank you, Rachel, for setting everything up. Again, a marvelous old radio behind you, and a lovely setup. You can always tell who the art historians are. I think that's the only thing I'm going to say there. So, I'll let you say hi, and then we'll kind of move on. So,
hi, it's nice to be here. I have a new camera. I hope it shows.
Oh yeah,
it looks wonderful.
Yay! Yep.
Yay.
That's it.
Yeah.
I'm not drinking tonight, which is a rare thing, but yeah, not just taking a little break.
This is my first time drinking since my wisdom teeth surgery, and I'm so excited.
Yeah, a lot of drinking happened last week because it was my birthday, so
nice.
Kind of taking a little break now.
Oh, that's right. She just mentioned happy birthday to Rachel. Everybody wish happy birthday to Rachel. You can put your well wishes in the Q&A along with your questions later on. But thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us, and I'll let you disappear into the background.
So,
happy birthday.
Bye. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We were so excited to have Professor Camilla Townsend here. She's a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers University. She has an amazing new book called Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, out with Oxford University Press. And we'll be talking about all sorts of stuff related to that. But I think, Varsha, you're going to start us off with our first question.
Yeah. So first question is, what's everybody drinking tonight?
Do I go first?
Yes.
Yes.
I guess always go first, of course.
Well, how could I not bring the classic Aztec drink, right? Okay. Basically hot chocolate. Cacahuat. Chocolate. Now, I wish I could tell you that I was way cool and I ground up the cacao beans and then frothed it through the air by having it fall from 5 feet or higher and catchy, but I didn't. I just bought abuelita cacao, abuelita cocoa in any, like the Goya aisle of any grocery store, and they cheat and they put ground sugar in with the ground cacao. So then when you add the hot water, it basically tastes like hot chocolate. If you want to be a little more authentic, like I try, you can add a little vanilla, you can add other spices, but you do have to pretend, if you want to pretend you're an ancient Aztec, that you didn't put the sugar in. And I do put the sugar in. So no alcohol. That way you won't see me floating around here, but
Well, I just had my wisdom teeth out last week, and so finally I can drink again because the swelling is down, it doesn't hurt anymore. So I'm having Akashi Japanese whiskey. It's really good, it's really smooth, and so if anybody's interested in Japanese whiskey, this is a good starter, I think. Yeah, Matt, what are you drinking?
So I have I made a cocktail because I haven't made a cocktail in a while, and sometimes I'm a little bit fancy with my cocktails. I have something called a Black Manhattan because I finally got some Averna Amaro, and it's Averna Amaro, which is a Sicilian Amaro, a bitter herbal liqueur with some rye and a little bit of orange bitters and a little bit of Angostura, and it's really sweet. It's a really nice kind of after dinner drink because Amaro is a digestive, and so it kind of helps you. And I had a cheeseburger, so I need something to help me digest because I'm an old person and I can't. Apparently, my body just stops working about digesting things. Anyway, but anyway, thank you again. The first thing I think I have to ask Camilla, if you don't mind, is so with your new book, Fifth Son, New History of the Aztecs. So got to get that subtitle in there. Is you're revisiting kind of not just kind of the narrative that maybe most people know about, which is again that encounter, right? The Spanish Aztec encounter, but you're talking about both kind of what happens before and what after, and centering Nahuatl or Mexican voices in that as much as possible. So is that something that seems to be more prominent, or is that something new that you were trying to do, or do you think that that's kind of a current scholarly development rather than simply reading kind of the European perspective onto these events?
Well, I guess both and. That is, There's no question that we're living in an era that interests itself in the voices of the previously disempowered or the once silenced. And in fact, in the case of the Aztecs, as we call them, they call themselves the Mexica, but let's say Aztecs. In the case of the Aztecs, there have been people working on trying to publicize the voice of the Aztecs really since the 50s and kind of successfully since the 60s. The difference, though, I mean, what is different about this book, I would say, is that I wasn't looking at the usual Aztec sources, quote unquote. That is usually what people mean when they say they're trying to, publish and publicize Aztec voices, is that they're studying texts that were written down with and by and for the friars and other Spaniards. That is, texts that were written in conjunction with Spaniards, often in response to questions posed by the Spaniards. Is it true, they would ask, that that your God used to hunger for the hearts of men? And they would say, oh yes, it is true, our God used to hunger for the hearts of men. What I wanted to do here that is quite different is focus entirely on their histories. They had a genre called the Xupohuali, the yearly account, basically. It was an old oral tradition, and then they started writing it down using the Roman letters to transcribe the performances. They never intended the Spaniards to hear these performances. They never intended the Spaniards to see what they were writing down. And almost nothing, very little has been done with these texts. So what's new about this is trying to write their history based on the histories that they wrote for themselves, for their own posterity, and entirely off the radar screen of the Spaniards or any other Europeans. Whereas in the past, when we've looked for indigenous voices, what we've been looking at are these indigenous sources written by and with and around and in response to Europeans, which are not the same, obviously, right? So there is something very new here. At the same time, it's part and parcel of what is becoming almost a tradition in the last generation and a half, I would say. Right.
Yeah. So I have to ask, it's sort of a two-parter. The first one is, what does the fifth son in the title of your book refer to? And then the second part is, why did you decide to study the Aztecs when you were back in grad school, undergrad, or whatever it is?
Okay, two very different questions. So the fifth son refers to the sun that we live under now. That is, the Aztecs believed that there had been 4 prior worlds that had imploded. It's not entirely clear how. Could be Big Bang-like, could be flooding, and they give us hints. But these 4 worlds with other beings had imploded, and then in the darkness and the void that followed, the gods got together and asked those remaining sort of human beings, human-like beings that were still there, to help them create a new sun and with it a new world. And a very frightened ancestor of the Aztecs, very humble guy, was kind of pressed into service, but did his utmost and agreed to leap, feet first into a great fire, and this made it possible for the sun to be reborn. he didn't want to do it. He wasn't arrogant about it, but for the sake of his people, he did it. Okay. So thanks to him, we have, human beings get to live in the light and the warmth, and we are still in this world. Today, some Nahuatl speakers, because there are 1.5 million Nahuatl speakers in Mexico, some of them joke amongst themselves that maybe we're starting the sixth sun now, because they find that so much is changing these days. Okay. But technically we're still in the fifth. Okay. And will be until the world implodes. So why am I doing this? You remind me when I was in Mexico a number of years ago, and one of my books came out in Spanish, every radio station I went to, because they were doing the publisher was promoting this book, basically I got a similar question, a kind of I'm caricaturing here, but a kind of so what's a nice gringo like you doing in our part of town? Why are you writing this book? Okay, right. Yeah. Okay. And at the time, it surprised me that this was the universal question. By the end of the tour, I wasn't surprised anymore, and I was ready for the question. But now it feels a little different in this context and coming from you. So I guess I would say I had no ancestral, genetic, or cultural heritage to explain this. Zilch, none. Okay. I did have a deep and abiding interest in all things Native American as a kid, but frankly, I think the preponderance of American kids from the dominant culture do, actually, right? I don't mean that they know much or that they're taught much very seriously, but like a lot of American kids are interested in Native Americans. So I don't think there's anything there in my childhood that would explain it. I will say that when I was young, as in young adult, I went off, as so many in my generation did, to Nicaragua. Many went elsewhere in Central America as an internationalist, internacionalista, and I taught 7th grade there in Sandinista Nicaragua, in revolutionary Nicaragua. And I came back utterly convinced that we needed to understand, we North Americans needed to understand more. And so I think that explains why when I went to graduate school, I ended up studying Latin America. And then one book kind of led to another. I didn't say when I was going to study Latin America, it was more about relative wealth and poverty than anything else. I didn't say, I'm going to study Native Americans per se, but one book led to another. And eventually, 20 years ago it is now, I found out about how many Nahuatl language sources still exist. They started, once they learned the alphabet, they went home, they learned it from the Spanish friars because the friars wanted them to read the Bible. But they went home and they started writing down everything their elders could say, could tell them, the old histories. We think the prayers too, although fewer of those survive, poems, other things. And once I realized, I was already a young professor when I grasped how much is preserved of what they were writing right away, which is, it's not a transparent window, but it's a pretty good window into the past before there were any white people around. So then I just thought, this is what I got to do. So I wish I could tell you some great story about my own sort of personal connection, but it started in Nicaragua with a deep desire to understand more about Latin America in general. And then one project led to another until I suddenly found myself one day surrounded by these sources and thinking, we've got to do more with these than has been done.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, because we often ask these questions of our guests, and everybody has a kind of a different narrative about how they've come to the study that the topic that they're so passionate about, right? But what's interesting about yours is, yours is a little bit different, but about the importance of travel. Right,
yes.
about going somewhere and experience something, even being aware of kind of your subjectivity and being an outsider in a situation like that is just,
absolutely.
And this is something I think, I certainly struggle with too. Like we have a lot of students who might want to do study abroad, for example, and just telling them like, I can't explain exactly how or why, but like, you're going to be different when you come back. Like you should do this, and if you can financially do that, and that's a separate kind of thing. But like you're just going to be a different person when if you can travel. And it's one of the really hard things about the pandemic. It's kind of wonderful being able to talk to people all over the place, but like not going places, like that makes it really hard.
It
right?
really makes a difference.
Yeah.
Really
the first archive I went to that was abroad was London, and even though like London is not very different from the United States, it's still Western.
It is.
But after a couple of weeks there, I was like, wow, I do feel like different, right? And so I can't imagine how amazing it must have felt after you got to be in the archives, and got to see all this stuff in South America. I think my next question is, a lot of students, if you're in high school or in college, you come out with a certain narrative about Aztecs and their interaction, with the Spanish, right? In your experience in teaching, what do you wish you could change about the narrative that students usually get, either in college or in high school?
Right. You know, even now, despite all our postmodern multicultural sensibilities, even now the kids are coming into class believing that, or many of them are, believing that the Aztecs thought the arriving white men were gods. They had mistaken Hernando Cortez for Quetzalcoatl. It is true that they don't all have that down pat like they used to. So I think we're beginning to get that out of the textbooks, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And I guess even deeper or more troubling would be this idea, it's so complicated, this idea that all the other Mesoamericans wanted to get rid of the Aztecs. It comes in the, it comes to us, this new idea in the guise of respect for indigenous people. Oh, so goes the argument, it wasn't really the Europeans who conquered them, it was other indigenous people allying with the Europeans. And why did they do that? Because they all hated the Aztecs so much, because they were such brutal killers and insensible beings that aren't really very human. I mean, now I'm putting words in their mouths, obviously, but that's the subtext. Okay, and in fact, some indigenous people sided with Europeans, many did not. The Aztecs did abuse their power, but they had been very vulnerable only 2 generations before that, and many other people in the Central Valley of Mexico and around actually wished that they could have such power and abuse others. It was not true that the whole world just shivered and shook at the thought of the Aztecs and was overwhelmingly glad to find, you know, outsiders that they could ally with and bring them down. So there are just so many troubling aspects of what people are willing to believe about the Aztecs. They've become sort of the quintessential villain. You can believe anything about them, you know, anything goes. And I do hope we can begin to tear that down, because I do think it has political ramifications. I mean, certainly descendant communities in Mexico have to live with the weight of that prejudice. But even here in the United States, I mean, when you think about the things that Trump said about Mexicans in general, it would sort of stagger the imagination that he could like say in public, you know, all Mexicans are savage, you know, rapists, killers, except that we've been taught that Mexicans are somehow inherently, quintessentially, on some primordial level, savages. So it does matter that we begin to take that apart, I think. At least, because I'm on my soapbox, I think it matters, right?
No, and I think one of the things that's really lovely about the Fifth Son, you know, and which you can find at our bookshop link if you want to see that sometime, is the way that you're trying to bring nuance to it. You know, I'm struck by the thing that immediately springs to mind is the way that you talk about King Montezuma, right? And that he's portrayed in this certain kind of manner as this kind of doddering and cowardly old fool. But you talk about how, you know, he was an astute kind of political leader. He was trying to deal with the situation, the kind of the hand that he was dealt. But at the same time, like not taking away from, you know, kind of the decisions that he made. I mean, still giving him agency within that. So he's not kind of a caricature. And I think that's kind of the best kind of history, right? Is to say like it's complicated. Like these were real people who made real decisions, and there were a lot of factors that kind of played into that.
Thank you, Matthew. That's exactly what I would want people to get from it. So you made my day. I think often people have asked me, so how does the whole story change? You know, now that we know what the indigenous people were thinking, is the plot completely different? And I can think of places where the plot is different than we thought that it was, and I, you know, give those answers. But at root, most of the set of events that we thought happened around the conquest did happen, but the nuance is entirely lost on the side of the Indians. So that's what we need this book and other books in the future to do, to show them as real people with complicated, troubling decisions to make, with sometimes, in fact, doing things that are contradictory because they couldn't decide, fighting with each other. One of the saddest parts is that while the Spaniards were surrounding their city and they were, you know, on the way to losing, it was sort of like like in other horrible situations in world history, when people know they're losing, they turn on each other. So you see the terrible infighting amongst the Mexica too. Anyway, all sorts of aspects of this situation, the story. And it's the nuance of those situations that remind us how real they were. And that's what I would want. And that's what I think, if they were here, those Aztec writers, those Mexica historians, that's what they would most want us to grasp. I really believe that. The details of what they believed and what they did, yes, they were proud of a lot of it, but what they would really want us to get is how hard and complicated the situation was, how hard they tried, how narrow their options were, etc. They would ask us to look at nuance. So thank you. You made my day.
Well,
right?
No, I think it's really, I mean, it's really a wonderful book. And I think one of the things that really comes out of, I mean, if I could just kind of follow up on this is, Montezuma kind of immediately sprang to mind, but the other big character, and I know you've written on this person before, is I'm sorry, I can't pronounce her name, but the woman that most people know as Malinche.
Malinche, right.
Yeah. So could you just tell us a little bit more about her? I mean, she has just an amazing kind of narrative, story to her life.
Right. She is the woman who translated for and in effect guided Hernando Cortez from the coast up to Mexico City. And a number of decades ago, historians sort of finally really grasped that she was not a turncoat. The old idea, the malinchista, the betrayer, the one who sided with the Spaniards rather than her own people, that this was not accurate because she was not an Aztec. Her people had been attacked by the Aztecs, and in the chaos of those wars, she was sold as a slave to the Mayas, and it was the Mayas who then gave her as a peace offering to Cortez. So why wouldn't she work with the Spaniards? The Aztecs were her enemy. By looking at the Nahuatl language sources, we get not only confirmation of that, but also the nuance of her situation. What becomes clear from the native language sources is that she figured out quite quickly what kind of a technological discrepancy there was and who was going to win this war. And she started to say to the people in different villages, we get this from different villages' histories, unbeknownst to each other. So it must be true. I mean, if more than one person is saying, she would explain to us, we're going to lose this war, and suggest that our best option for saving our lives and our polity would be to ally with these strangers now. And some of them did, and some of them didn't. And one historian said, sort of, if only we had known, if only we had done what she said, So it wasn't that she immediately changed everybody's mind, but she had a nuanced grasp of the situation and what their options were, and was trying to convey this to people who themselves could not know, because they were not sitting around hearing all that she was hearing and seeing the messages and the ships and everything that she had seen. So I think, again, the more that we know about what they were really doing and thinking from their own sources, the more likely we are to believe that they existed and respect their choices. I mean, but I think once you know all this about her, you can't possibly think of her as a traitor and a whore. That those days have to be over. I mean, if anything, she's awfully vulnerable and in great pain much of the time. A survivor. Yeah. Well, I say a survivor. She still died by her late 20s of, one of the diseases that the Europeans brought. But she survived the conquest. That was something.
Yeah. And I mean, she seems to be clearly asserting her agency, trying to make kind of, for the lack of a better term, kind of the best of the situation. But at the same time, like you said, suffering terribly at the same time, because I mean, they're not treating her well.
Very well,
right?
At all.
Yeah.
No, not at all. Right. Before they figure out that she can be useful as a translator, she's just given to the Puerto Carrero was his name, but probably the cruelest guy in the expedition. I mean, there were lawsuits back in Spain from Spanish families because he had been so brutal to their daughters. Okay. So, right, we should not imagine that this was a woman just sort of prancing around, flirting and doing whatever she wanted to do when she wanted to do it. Hardly, right?
Yeah.
I have sort of a question that takes us in a different direction, but it's also based on our accepted narratives of the Spanish victory and then the interaction, right? So generally, there's a lot of historians or previous scholars in the past few decades who have been looking at these big picture explanations for why agriculture or economic divergence happened in the West and didn't happen in Latin America or for Native Americans or those in Africa. And so how has your study of the Aztecs sort of changed, or if not changed, added some nuance to the understanding of how did Aztecs, understand economy, agriculture, how did they develop differently? And how does that sort of challenge the narrative that the West brought everything, all this knowledge?
to them. So, boy, this is a tough one. My research doesn't illuminate that question, but it does illuminate what Aztecs thought about that question. So I am convinced, I know this is like a hot button issue and we could easily get derailed and start arguing with each other probably, but I am convinced that what the plant biologists figured out when radiocarbon dating techniques got so much better, which is where farming started, and then where full-time farming started. Apparently people around the world were planting seeds, all the time while they hunted and gathered, and then they'd circle back and collect what they planted. But where full-time farming started, in the Fertile Crescent, and the radiocarbon dating techniques, the improvements therein helped people in the 90s figure out which plants got where, when, and it's very clear, I believe, that where there was a constellation of really protein-rich plants, more and more people would turn to full-time farming. And where there wasn't a constellation of protein-rich plants, it didn't happen. So you get farming first in the Fertile Crescent and spreading out from there, the wheat and the legumes, basically. And in the New World, corn and beans do work, but teosinte, ancient corn, has to be, the kernels are very tiny, and you have to plant the largest kernels and the largest kernels generation by generation to make it into something. And then you have to discover that you have to eat it on the same day as you eat beans to get a complete protein. They each have different amino acids. So when that did happen, they did become full-time farmers, but this was roughly 4 to 5 millennia later than it happened in the Fertile Crescent, where wheat and peas were sort of available for eating as is, very protein rich, much earlier. So I think, again, many people reject this because they want it to be all culturally induced, but I don't. I think human choices about hunting versus agriculture are basically hunger induced. So it makes sense to me, given where the protein-rich plants were, that they started farming so much earlier in the old world than in the new. Well, what that means is that when old world people came face to face with new world people, they could clobber them. If it had been the Chinese, they would have clobbered the Aztecs too. Now, if the Aztecs had come face to face with the ancient Sumerians, who had also been farming for just a couple of millennia, that would have been a fair fight. Who knows what would have happened then, okay? So it's not a question of old world versus new world, or this culture versus that culture, but sort of how long have you had sedentary life? The longer you have, the more people you have, the more weapons you have, denser population, ships, etc. So what's fascinating to me, though, looking at the Aztec sources, is that they identified that as the subject that needed to be explained. So they didn't know about radiocarbon dating. They couldn't explain why, they didn't know about how long they'd been farming. What they knew was that these newcomers had incredible technology that they didn't have. And it wasn't that they couldn't understand it, because these weren't computers. This was like a much bigger boat that they brilliantly took up, as this is their words, took a blanket and hooked it up to catch the wind. Why didn't we think of that? Well, they would have thought of that. They had great boats. Had they continued to boat for another 1,000 years or so, they wouldn't have done that. So, and the same with the cannons. They figured out this was, far more powerful than any of the bows that they had. And they asked why. They didn't have, access to a good explanation. But it's funny, recently, I think politically correct historians have wanted to deny that there was any difference. And that they never did. That is, I never find in the sources the Aztecs pretending to themselves that there is no difference. They quickly realize they've got a big problem. These people are going to defeat us, and they do what they can to cope with that. And they do make the war take longer. One of them said, like a cat playing with a clever mouse, but we were still the mouse. There I'm quoting, right? They could make the war take longer, but they could tell they weren't going to be able to defeat these people permanently. So it's just stunning to me that they, within just a few years, really probably months, we don't know, when you think about how quickly they were adjusting to this, figuring out that they had a technological problem that they couldn't explain any more than we could until the 1990s, and these radiocarbon dating techniques improved their understanding of the history of farming. But I think it's very cool that they did not waste time kind of imagining that the situation was other than it was. Of course, they weren't worried. There was no politically correct, how to put this? I think people who don't study disempowered peoples are sometimes afraid that they're going to get accused of racism if they even acknowledge that the Europeans had more power than the disempowered people, but they weren't caught up in any of that. They weren't deep down worried if they were stupid, not at all. They knew how smart they were. They weren't worried about that. They just wanted to figure out how they could manage to defeat these people, even without that technology, without, and they couldn't figure that out. So anyway, I wish I could say that my work has played into resolving that puzzle of, why people become farmers when they do and how much advantage it gives you. But I think I am going to have to sort of leave that to the archaeologists. What I can offer is that the Aztecs themselves had a really sophisticated understanding of kind of what their problem was turning out to be, just not why.
Yeah. There's a lovely anecdote that you have in the book about during the final kind of siege and taking of Tenochtitlan is that the Aztecs kind of seize some crossbows and they seize some cannon, and they're trying to figure out how to use them because they know they're really important and like they understand the technology, but they just don't have the materials and they can't turn
and they don't
them
have the
around.
gunpowder and
they don't have the gunpowder. Yeah.
Right.
So it's
So
clear they understand kind of what's going in.
What's going on? They clearly get it. And so they sink the cannon in the lake. At least then it won't come into the other man's hands, but they can't. Right. They don't have the gunpowder. Right.
So I think we have some wonderful questions in the Q&A, Varsha. I think we should probably move to the second part of Drinking with Historians, or Drunk with Historians, perhaps. I think if it's okay, like I'll take the first one. Lucy asked a question about sources. For those of you, everybody should of course read the book. But if people who are unfamiliar with the types of sources that you're talking about, these native these native sources that aren't kind of influenced by the friars, could you talk a little bit kind of more about them? She asked specifically about, and I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, the Tira de Tepechpan, perhaps. Yeah. So is that kind of one of the things that you're talking about, or yeah? Could you just talk a little bit more about sources?
Right. No, that's great. Actually. No, it's not that I'm prejudiced against either the Tira de Tepechpan or any of the other tiras or lienzos, but these, those images that were constructed by Mesoamericans, Aztecs, Mexica, and other Altepecs, other communities, in the colonial period, often in the 16th century, sometimes, although not always, for a court case. And they often made use of the old glyphic tradition. So you would see who ruled and what the land boundaries were, et cetera. And then these visual texts could be presented in court. And it sounds like we may have possibly an expert on one of the tiras in the audience. And they're very valuable for understanding the colonial era, for looking at the glyphs, for thinking about why the visual tradition was what it was. The texts I'm studying are quite different. There was a tradition of the Shupohuali, the yearly account, which was also glyphic. There would be a long line. They had a complex and long ancient calendar. And along then each year, there would be images, probably very similar to images that you might find on sources like the Tira de Tepechpan. And those images were served as mnemonic devices to usually a man, we think, around a fire, reciting or telling the history. And then often other men would, or other people, but we think always men, would rise from different lineages or different sub-communities to tell their side of the story, what that war was like, et cetera. So what happened after the conquest then was that when the young, again, mostly guys who were studying with the friars came home with their new tool, the Roman alphabet, they would say to, say, Uncle Joe, tell me the history that you used to tell. And he would begin to speak. And they would write this down so that every word that the man spoke was being written down. So what we have now are dozens of these texts that are alphabetic, written in the Roman letters, but that record the speech act of these Nahuatl historians telling their history. And then later in the colonial period, what they would do is take those early texts and knit some of them together, add their own commentary, et cetera. So by the 17th century, we have a whole nother layer on this. But the earlier ones are very much the, writing down what Uncle Joe used to say even before the conquest. So in that sense, I find them much richer than what we've worked with before. In the past, we've worked with sources that were written with the friars, sort of hand in hand with the friars, or like visual sources that were produced for a court case, but you can't hear the jokes, you can't hear them expressing anger, you can't hear the political details, the nuance. Whereas in these alphabetic sources, you're getting full sentences going on for pages and pages, some of them hundreds of pages. I shouldn't say some, that's very rare. Most of them shorter than that. And so that's really something, to hear people basically speaking freely and openly, a kind of stream of consciousness in some cases, about what happened in that year or in that war in their own language. This was for their own children. They had no intention of showing these to the Spaniards. So we're able to tell, offer a much richer history than we can from just looking at those visual texts of the 16th century. Not that I wish to discourage such studies. And if we have an expert in the audience, I'm delighted. We need that work too. But I will stand by the importance of these alphabetic texts as representing sort of full and free speech.
There's another really great question about disease and the Aztec defeat. I think a lot of the narrative that you get in high school or in college is that disease was like the major thing that like led to the Aztec defeat. So like, I think I'm going to change the question a little bit that James asked, is like, how big of a role did disease play in the defeat of the Aztecs?
It sounds like the questioner and you too, Varsha, are really onto it. That is, yes, disease was relevant, but it wasn't the thing, the factor that we've been taught. I think what happened was we had no good explanation until they improved radiocarbon dating techniques and then could figure out what had happened with the farming. So, well-intentioned multicultural types, postmodernists from the 1980s onward were thinking hard, how do we explain this to our students without recourse to racism? And it seemed like, the disease factor, that'll do it, okay? The problem is it doesn't really work. It was huge, it was devastating. And one of the most devastating angles of the work I've done is sort of reading about their own descriptions of what happened to some of them in these epidemics. So I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it doesn't really explain conquest on its own for a couple of reasons. One, as we now know in our bones, epidemics kill somewhere between, say, 2% and smallpox about 20% of the population. This idea that kind of everybody died, it never was true. And now I think we all grasp that's never the case. They move through. Even if we hadn't mitigated, we would have lost many more millions of people. But this time next year, some would have been left alive, okay? 98% of the adult population indeed would have been left alive, devastated, but alive. So even after smallpox, the worst smallpox, 80% of the population is left alive. Over the course of a century with repeated epidemics, they ended up losing a total of 90%. So, but in the moment of the conquest, that's not enough of an explanation. Likewise, we can't have it both ways. We say, well, the Spaniards only won because they were allying with these indigenous people who hated the Aztecs, right? We covered that before. Then we forget, okay, the Aztecs are leveled by disease, but so are the allies. The most famous allies were the Tlaxcalans. Both camps were leveled by smallpox in 1521 for about 3 months. Then the disease moved on, and the 80% of them or more who had survived stood back up and went back to their lives, okay, including fighting, unfortunately. So it's the wars, the diseases mattered, but it's simply not the case that that's all we need to know. There are even places in the New World where you see the Europeans win resounding victories, destroy whole city-states before the first epidemic even starts. Okay? So we're just going to get ourselves trapped right in front of our students with egg on our faces if we try to cling to disease as the sole explanation. But it was part of the technological advantage that the Europeans had. All those millennia of farming meant people were living with their animals, which meant more diseases were being introduced into the European repertoire of disease. So it's all part of the same package, even if we can't call disease technology.
Yeah. I think we all know something about kind of zoonotic plagues and pandemics and things like that. Nowadays, so,
sadly.
Yeah, sadly. There's another question, kind of, I think is a little bit, it's specific, but I'm going to broaden it out. He just asked about comparative history. And specifically thinking about kind of comparative empires. And I think anybody who, maybe I'm overgeneralizing and this is a bad assumption, and please tell me I'm wrong, is, you know, if you're studying kind of Latin America in this particular period, you have so many different kind of great city states and stuff like that. You have to do a little bit of comparative work because they're not the same, right? Like they're very different. But I think like thinking kind of further afield, like you mentioned, like the Aztecs versus the Sumerians or something like that. Is there value in thinking kind of much more broadly about kind of larger polities like this, do you think?
Well, you know, I honestly am not sure, but I do have to say, I've recently been reading a lot about ancient Mesopotamia, and I mean, I'm no expert. I'm reading about it as a layperson, and I'm struck over and over again by some commonalities. And I've had Asianist friends say the same thing when they look at the earliest Asia, that is, those who are experts in that field, and then read what I do. Some of them think, wow. So I think there are some commonalities among us humans. We're not all the same. I don't mean that. I mean, all people studying the language of the Aztecs, I'm the last one to say culture and language don't matter. Of course they do. But I think the psychoanalysts who've been saying that we humans have a lot in common may turn out to be correct. Right? And that that there are, in fact, a lot of things that different civilizations do that are at least comparable. It's never going to be exactly the same. And the more isolated a culture is, the wilder and more interesting some of their choices, like the Incas. You know, it was a quote pristine civilization, as the anthropologists call it, meaning and living in isolation, relative isolation. And they were the only ones who thought we're going to have an entire complex writing system, all done with weaving, braiding, and knots. Right? I mean, no, everyone else was busy scratching and painting in a two-dimensional surface. So I don't mean that wildly sort of incomparable things don't happen. Of course they do. But it does seem to me that there is value in those of us who can, learning as much as we can about other civilizations. The problem is it's so much work, and we have to start from scratch in a part of the world we don't know much about, which I think explains why more of us don't do it. But I hope your listener is someone who is doing it. Follow him or her.
I have to ask something that's not in the Q&A, but I just realized how important it is. So, okay, we haven't asked this of our guests for a while, but there's like a decent amount of like pretty bad pop culture, I'm assuming, about Native Americans. The worst that I remember, but I loved this movie as a kid, was The Road to El Dorado. So I guess my question to you is, how bad, which I know it's bad, is The Road to El Dorado, but also are there any worse pop culture like that you just hate watching that like are representative of like Native Americans or Mesoamericans that you just
actually
despise?
Varsha, you have good instincts. Of all the stuff out there, especially for kids on Native Americans, I actually think Road to El Dorado is probably the best. I mean, at the same time as that movie was being made, La Otra Conquista was being made in Mexico, and soon after that, Terrence Malick did his, you know, Jamestown, Pocahontas. But these, you know, very supposedly woke guys were making films for us grown-ups, which basically trotted out the usual tropes about, you know, the usual narratives about Native Americans that leave them adoring, you know, parting the branches as the Europeans arrive and watching and even worshiping them, versus The Road to El Dorado, where they know that these are just some very strange looking travelers.
Exactly.
And they make snarky comments, and they disagree with each other. And one of them says, well, we could pretend he's a god. Maybe we can then, you know, use that in our relations with the other people. And so they show them as being very sophisticated. I will say though, and because I've taught with that film, I have students watch parts of it and then we talk about it. Many of the Latina students, and I don't mean Latinx, I mean the Latinas, the girls, the young women, are very distressed. The Rosie Perez character they find just positively embarrassed. I mean, she's fallen out of her bathing suit all over the place, you know, and they just feel, watching that with a lot of white boys in class next to them, it's just very humiliating. And if there was one thing I wish we could redo about that movie was, you know, she was very smart, very, you know, snappy. She's in many ways an admirable character. She's a survivor. If only they hadn't felt a need to take her clothes off and have her, you know, thinking about sex an awful lot of the time, because that does unfortunately, I think, lower the level of the whole film. But you were not wrong. And I guess I've already mentioned La Otra Conquista and Terrence Malick. There are so many movies that are positively painful to watch. The first time I watched the Terrence Malick film, I couldn't get through the whole thing. I since have, because one must, but it's just so tiresome in this day and age when you get the same old two-dimensional Native Americans watching in awe at
Yeah.
the European men. Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a plodding movie. I mean, in fairness,
Oh,
like
yes.
it's just incredibly dull. Can I ask a follow-up a pop culture question? Because I think it gets at something else that I think is kind of maybe, it's certainly a stereotype, and it's something you obviously deal with and try to kind of nuance, is about Mel Gibson's movie Apocalypto.
Yes.
And specifically about human sacrifice and kind of the practice of that there. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that? Because I think that's another kind of conception, right? It's one of the kind of the great stereotypes that's kind of thrown at the Native Americans by the Europeans almost immediately. It's justification very early on, as early as Valladolid, probably before that as well. And then it kind of gets walked back, and then it's so where is it now? Like, what do we know about kind of human sacrifice?
Well, just very quickly, about Apocalypto, before we go to human sacrifice.
Sure.
I actually think the first 15 minutes of Apocalypto are probably the greatest footage that we have about hunter-gatherers. They're just people. They're just effing people. They're laughing at each other, getting mad, tripping when they drop something. And yet it's not a spoof of them either.
Yeah.
They're speaking their own language. Everything's fine. However, the rest of the movie is probably the worst footage that we have about that. It's supposed to be about the Mayas, although in fact it's really about Tenochtitlan. It's visually, it's a copy of Tenochtitlan. The whole thing comes out of descriptions of Tenochtitlan. We only are told that it's about the Mayans because that's the language that he used to have the script written. Anyway, the reason I think it's so dreadful is it plays up the very worst stereotypes. That is, it's almost like it's orgiastic. These people, hundreds of people, are thrilled at the sight of the blood and everything. In fact, it was something very serious, very sad. It was a power play, but that's a lot different from sort of an orgiastic thrill. It was a power play in this sense, that is, most archaeologists agree now that most ancient humans practiced some kind of human sacrifice and practiced some kind of enslavement of prisoners of war. And usually the two things went together. That is, usually it was a prisoner of war who was sacrificed. This happens all over the world, here and there. They have found evidence. There's no question that the Native Americans did this. That is, that the women and children, especially the young women and children, were usually adopted, almost never killed, but young warriors faced torture and death and honor. They were then honored. If they died without screaming, it was a great honor. And the people who were doing this knew that it could happen to them next time, and they expected to get the same honor if they died so bravely. So the Aztecs took this really nearly universal custom that was rare. One person or two people would die, say, at the end of a 2-year war, right? They took the fact of human sacrifice, and towards the end of their 100-year rise to power, they turned it into a political sort of cudgel that they used against everybody else. They said, now we won't just kill one person when we've killed, won a great battle. We're going to kill dozens every month when we have a special ceremony. And if you don't join our empire willingly and voluntarily and happily, then it's your young people that we're going to sacrifice next month. Okay? And in fact, in one of the histories, it actually says, one of the Nahuatl speakers says, we used to bring people from the edge of our world, people from areas we wanted to conquer, to bring into the empire, bring them to see some of the most frightening sacrifice ceremonies, and then let them go. The whole point, they actually say this, was to terrorize them and convince them that they should go home and convince their people to join the empire voluntarily. Okay? So it's not just I or other, politically correct people who want to believe this, that it had turned into a terror tactic and was not really a deeply spiritual event anymore. It is simply the case. We actually have the smoking gun. We have the written evidence that that is what they were doing. So it did become something dreadful. I sort of liken it to the dirty war period in Latin American history, and the US State Department was actively involved in promoting that. So good people, supposedly in good countries, well-meaning countries at the peak of their power, do sometimes do dreadful things, and the Aztecs certainly did. What we know about the ceremony originally, before it was turned into a political tactic, was that it was very grave and serious, and something that somebody would want to do to bring honor to their own people. Okay? Some of the Aztecs' earliest stories are about their own young people agreeing to die this way after their people have been defeated, because they hope to, to please the gods. They hope to bring honor to their people, to make their posterity's life better. So we mustn't imagine that they had this sort of inhuman delight in death. It was a grave and, in their mind, ultimately necessary sacrifice on the part of a few. I guess it reminds me a little bit of ancient Christian associations with the death of Christ, with the idea of noble young men, noble young soldiers who are willing to go to war for their people. It was that sort of that was embedded. It did then get distorted and magnified. I'm the first to acknowledge that. But it isn't true that they had a sort of group-wide mania, sort of physical pleasure that they took in watching lots of people die. In fact, the poets, because we have some of the poetry too that survives, lament this and bemoan the need for death. So again, the fact that the political leaders were doing this does not mean that all the Aztecs were delighted by it. Not at all. Okay. I'm glad you made me talk about that, Matt, because in fact, it's sort of tempting to kind of skip that subject, kind of skirt around it, because it's not the Aztec, the view of Aztecs I want to encourage, but we have to face the truth. Otherwise, right.
Absolutely.
So the last question that I will ask is that we've touched on women a little bit throughout this past hour, right? Like Malinche and others. JR asks, when you're reading the sources from the Aztecs, is there a lack of like women in the sources, either as writers or as subjects? And if so, how do you deal with the silences and write about them? And if we have time, the follow-up to that is, what was the role of women in Aztec society? Like, was it, because like a lot of, when you're in high school, you learn a lot about like matrilineal Native American societies in North America. Is that similar in Aztec society, or is it completely different?
Right. So that's a great sort of braided conglomeration of questions. The sources, we think, were almost entirely uttered by men at first and written by boys and young men. There were some exceptions. We have proof of a couple of women being involved, but very rarely. They weren't proscribed. Women were not veiled. There was no sense that women should, be seen and not heard, nothing like that. But it was a more masculine endeavor. And indeed, most of the Xiuhpohualli tell stories that, here I'm resorting to stereotype, but that men would tell about leaders, male leaders, about wars, winning and losing, etc. However, because of women's role in their political sense of self as a society, women do end up playing a role in these stories. How to put this? Some of the societies were matrilineal, some were patrilineal. But even if you were patrilineal, that is, even if it was a man's children who would take after him, it mattered a great deal who the mothers were. So you wouldn't say that a chief was going to be succeeded by, say, a child of the lowest ranking wife or woman in the compound. On the contrary, it'd be expected that he'd be succeeded by someone high ranking from some other high ranking polity. So they kept careful track of sort of which prince had which mother, okay? And so these women do appear in the stories, often confused with each other. Sometimes their names are less well known than the men's names are known. So often many of the puzzles that we have to resolve because of contradictions in the sources do have to do with the women. But what is clear is how much it mattered how power was traced through women. So I would take liberties in the sense that I would say in the footnote, we don't really know that this woman's name was this. One story says it was, another story says it was different. But what we know is that it was the fact that it was the king's sister who had been, say, taken in a skirmish that explains why they had this next war. Okay? So women do come up in the histories, and I was looking for ways to do that because I am very much interested in gender analysis. I'm very much interested in women's history. So I did kind of pull out of the sources as much as I could, although I think there is another book or two waiting to be written about the women in these sources, beyond what I found. So if there are young people out there who want to do it, I would say go for it. Okay.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Yes, this has been a wonderful conversation. I think there's a question I do want to kind of just bring back. Just maybe this is a short question, maybe it's a really long question, but it was a question about language, and specifically about kind of what do we know about? I mean, because we're dealing with pictoglyphs, and so how can we reconstruct kind of the language of these sources, these indigenous peoples that we're talking about so much? I mean, I think probably people are not kind of familiar with this type of reconstruction, so.
Right, well, if we just had the visual sources, we actually couldn't. I mean, I think that's why what the art historians and the historians who have worked with these sources can do for us is limited. It's valuable, but it is limited because we can look at all of the glyphs, and we can figure out to greater or lesser extent what they were getting at. Gordon Whittaker has a great book coming out very shortly. So it's sort of a compendium of what we can know about the glyphs, but we can't reconstruct full language. So that's why it's just so valuable that in the early 1500s, these young men, the students of the friars, went home with the Roman alphabet and said to their grandparents and their parents, start talking. I'm going to write down every word you say, and sounding it out using the Roman letters to do this. Because it's only because I have those texts that I can do this. Otherwise, I would just be reconstructing, looking at the glyphs and sort of trying to figure out what, maybe this is when he mentions the story of that wife, but we can't be sure. We certainly can't tell what attitude they had towards that wife, whether they thought it was funny or sad or liked her or didn't. That sort of stuff we can only get when we have the full rich source. So we're all, I think, very lucky that these indigenous people, wrote all this down, and that finally we're beginning to have translated enough of them to put it together into histories that we can read. Because if we first look at just what they wrote, it isn't only a question of learning Nahuatl. There's that, but then you have to have read enough of the histories to see, like, why do they keep talking about where the prisoners were sent? This is about, when you read enough of them, you realize this is about how badly they were beaten in that war. If their high-level women are being taken as lowly slaves to some other society, that was a total defeat. So you first have to learn the Nahuatl, then you have to learn why they're writing about the things they're writing about. But we're getting there. And since we have these sources, we really will be able, I think, to write rich and detailed works about what they were thinking about, what they were doing, why they did it.
Yeah, I think it's hard to explain, right, to people who are kind of unfamiliar with just kind of the serendipity of certain sources surviving, of certain decisions being made to write certain things down at certain times. And, it's not like, and I'm going to make fun of Varsha for a second, like not the Martinists who have like a million sources and everything's like archived and cataloged and stuff like that.
We have our difficulty too.
You have your difficulty. You do. That's
exactly right. All historians, we either have way too much or way too little, right?
That's right. It's never just the right amount. It's never. That's the life of the historian. So anyway, this has been a phenomenal conversation. We are just about, unfortunately, out of time for our episode, but thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Rachel, behind the scenes, for organizing the questions and stuff like that, and of course, thank you to our guest, Dr. Townsend, for illuminating us. Again, go out and buy the book Fifth Son. It's a really wonderful introduction, examination, lots of nuance about the Aztecs. But until then, we'll be back in 2 weeks. We actually have no guests in 2 weeks. It's just me and Varsha answering your questions. So bring your questions. Join us. Until then, cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks again, Dr. Townsend.